Welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're talking about the tyranny of merit, what has become of the common good by Michael Sandel. Sandel, student of Charles Taylor, uh, and Harvard philosopher, and generally loosely affiliated with the communitarian school. The funny thing about communitarians is almost nobody who is a communitarian wants to be a communitarian. They all take issue with the term because they all define community and viability somewhat differently. Nonetheless, in our explorations of what's happened with liberal democracy, both within capital and capitalism, but also as an epiphenomenal effect of the sociology of that, we have to deal with the decline myth and reemergence of the myth of meritocracy. In some ways, this is an old debate, and almost nobody believes in meritocracy anymore, although what they blame as being the corruptive element that is non-meritocratic varies greatly. What systemic issue? Is it the elites? Is it racism? Is it gender? Is it class, etc.? And to some degree, I would say, it's all of the above. But there's also a way in which a lot of the current political discourse around this is moving the goalpost so you only apply these criterions to one group that you dislike and not the groups that you like. Do you hate the professional managerial class but like petite bourgeois managers? Etc. So we need to be more consistent, and we need to think about the course of the problem. And I think this book is interesting, although I also think this book has some issues. So we're going to read. I'll be doing some readings and discussions of this on the show. This is going to define the problem. This is from the first chapter, Winners and Losers. These are dangerous times for democracy. The danger can be seen in rising xenophobia and in growing public support for autocratic figures who test and limit the democratic norms. These trends are troubling in themselves. Equally alarming is the fact that mainstream parties and political display little understanding of the discontent that is roiling politics around the world. As a side note, as I talked with Joel Wainwright of Climate Leviathan fame, one of the two authors of that book, that we've seen this in response to the instability tied to the economic system, the climate, increased inequality, etc., for a while. In fact, you have the dreaded triple crisis, which is economic inequality, economic instability, and environmental instability, both in the terms of the climate crisis and in general pollution, but also in the terms of like cities becoming dysfunctional, infrastructure breaking down, etc. Some denounce the upsurge of populist nationalism as little more than a racist, xenophobic reaction against immigrants and multiculturalism. Others see it mainly in economic terms as a protest against job losses brought on by global trade and new technology. But it is a mistake to see only the bigotry in the populist protest, or to view it only as an economic complaint. Like the triumph of Brexit in the United Kingdom, the election of Donald Trump in 2016 was an angry verdict on decades of rising inequality and a version of globalization that benefits those at the top but leaves ordinary citizens feeling disempowered. It also is a rebuke to the technocratic approach to politics that is tone deaf to the resentments of people who feel the economy and culture has left them behind. By the way, I think this is not only truer now after COVID, that everything it describes got accelerated during COVID. Wealth inequality went up massively. People feeling like they were dealing with elites who were non-responsive went up massively, particularly actually outside of the United States. There's seeming to be no political answer to any problem at all that doesn't get undercut by either the courts or the boondoggle of a legislative process continues to get worse. But let's go on. The hard reality is that Trump was elected by tapping a wellspring of anxieties, frustrations, and legitimate grievances to which the mainstream parties have no compelling answer. A similar predicament afflicts European democracies, and before they can cope to win back public support, these parties must rethink their mission and purpose. To do so, they should learn from populist protests that has displaced them, not by replicating the xenophobia or strident nationalism, but by taking seriously the legitimate grievances with those ugly sentiments are entangled, which I actually think is true. I agree with Sandel on this. You don't try to win over the conservative by appealing to their worst traits. You win over the conservative by fixing the problems that the conservative cares about. Some of them will never go with you, but then you can know that what is driving that is purely political affiliation, identitarian ideation, which is identitarian ideation is like using your ideology as your identity category. But you take a lot of the myth there, but this is tied into some other things. The mainstream parties and governing elites who find themselves at the target of populist protest struggle to make sense of it. They typically diagnose this discontent in two ways: as an animus against immigrants and racial and ethnic minorities, or as an anxiety of the face of globalization and technological change. Both diagnoses miss something important. I would also add that now that some of those center parties are back in power, they have not reversed some of the populist changes. Biden has not liberalized border immigration. It became too politically unpopular, and nor has he been able to, by even sometimes doing things to the right of Trump on who he lets in, has he been able to get conservative discontent about it any more relieved. There is no way for either side to win this game other than to pretend that they are doing something they're not. Let's skip a section. Technocracy and market-friendly globalization. At the heart of this failure being the failure of politics to deliver in such a way that didn't have populist protests, both left and right, is the way mainstream parties conceived and carried out the project of globalization over the past 4 decades. As a side note, that is over now, so it's going to be interesting what happens now that globalization is winding down. We are seeing the world system start to not completely decouple. Such complete decoupling would be disastrous for everyone involved, but it is going to decouple a good bit. That's what we call multipolarity. Two aspects of this project give rise to the conditions that fuel populist protests. One is the technocratic way of perceiving the public good, and the other is the meritocratic way of defining winners and losers. The technocratic conception of politics is bound up with a faith in markets, not necessarily unfeathered, laissez-faire capitalism, but a broader belief that market mechanizations are the primary instrument for achieving the public good. By the way, this is, as much as we complain about neoliberalism, this neoliberal assumption is still in both parties. Both parties favor markets and public-private partnerships and modifications to markets as the primary adjudicator of public goods, who does the goods, and what people want. This way of thinking about politics is technocratic in the sense that it drains public discourse of any substantive moral argument and treats ideological contestable questions as if they were just matters of economic efficiency, the province of experts. And I'm going to say, a lot of my left liberal friends actually talk about, politics needs professionals, and then they talk about the problems of democracy, and I hate to tell them that's a fundamental contradiction. If you believe that not just the implementation of policy needs professionals, but that the making of policy needs professionals, then democratic input is irrelevant. Sorry, that is what is implied by that. It is a fundamental contradiction that most left liberals I know do believe. It is not difficult to see how technocratic faith in markets set the stage for populist discontent. Market-driven versions of globalization brought on glowing inequality everywhere, not just between the first and the second world, but also within the first world. It also devalued national identities and allegiances. Yes, but also no. We can get back into that later. I think Sandel's a little floaty on here. As goods and capital flow freely across national borders, as to stride the global economy, valorize cosmopolitan identities as progressive and enlightened alternatives to the narrow parochial way of protectionism, tribalism, and conflict. The real political divide, they argued, was no longer left versus right, but open versus closed. And it implied the critics of outsourcing, free trade agreements, and unrestricted capital flows were closed-minded rather than open-minded, tribal rather than global. Meanwhile, the technocratical approach to government treated many public questions as matters of technical expertise beyond the reach of the ordinary citizen. This narrow scope of democratic argument hollowed out the terms of public discourse and produced a growing sense of disempowerment. By the way, this worries me because a lot of people I know who believe in public sovereignty are also big fans of expanding the administrative state, which does not overseen by Congress. Now, admittedly, currently in the United States, and from what I can tell, a whole lot of the Western world, Congresses and parliaments are dysfunctional. But, there is a sense in which the expanding of the administrative state does not actually incentivize Congress to ever be functional. If it's always the province of an administrative state, which can be adjudicated in the courts, then why should the legislatures do anything but appeal to people to continue giving them money? The market-friendly technocratic conception of globalization was embraced by mainstream parties of the left and the right, but it was the embrace of market thinking and market values by the center-left parties that proved most consequential for globalization project itself and for the populist protests that followed. By the time of Trump's election, the Democratic Party became the party of technocratic liberalism, more congenial to the professional classes than the blue-collar and middle-class voters, which constituted its base. And you can see this actually in the trajectory of Hillary Clinton. In 2008, Hillary Clinton actually tried to do a blue-collar workerist appeal. If you don't believe me, go back and look. She was like running, we represent workerist Arkansas and stuff. It was only in 2016 where she, against Trump, where she actually completely flipped the narrative. She's a political creature and saw where the things were going. She's a political creature whose political instincts have always served her too late, but nonetheless doesn't change the fact she's a political creature. The same was true of Britain's Labour Party at the time of Brexit and the social democratic parties of Europe. The transformation had its origins in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher had argued that government was a problem and that markets were the solution. And when they passed from the political scene, the left-center parties that succeeded them, Bill Clinton in the U.S., Tony Blair in Britain, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, moderated but consolidated the market faith. They softened the harsh edges of unfettered markets, but did not challenge the central premise of the Reagan-Thatcher era. That's because they couldn't. As a side note, like in this way, Michael Sandel almost sounds like David Harvey. It's not that he's wrong. It's just it makes it sound like it's all politically determined. I'll get back to that later. This is always some of. I do think sometimes we can pretend things are more economically determined than they are too, but there's the tension here. We'll get back to that. Back to the book. The market mechanisms are the primary instrument for achieving public good. In line with this faith, they embrace market-friendly versions of globalization, recognize and welcome the glowing financialization of the economy. And in many ways, as pointed out by Naomi Klein of all people in The Shock Doctrine of all books, where she fails to notice that it's the Keynesians and social democrats who are able to more thoroughly and easily neoliberalize because they already control so many elements of the state. And they already have such strong public-private partnerships. The left actually did this better than the right. Yeah, it's damning. And it's not just in the U.S. All that seemed to change when Barack Obama appeared on the political scene. In his 2008 presidential campaign, he offered a stirring alternative to managerial technocratic language that came to characterize liberal political discourse. And I think we forget this, that while he was groomed as a creature of the political elite, Adolf Reed was on to him in the 1990s, as we all like to say. There is also a thing about Obama that we forget, and that's that even though he immediately established himself as an extension of the Clinton era and Atari Democrat era establishment of the DMC in his selection of choices and his general moderation, in fact, he was pretty conservative in the way he ran his role in the Democratic Party, so much so that the Obama era created very little of a legacy that wasn't already there. We might argue that Joe Biden is a legacy of Barack Obama, but he is older than Barack Obama. And many of the people that Barack Obama empowered were the old power elites going all the way back to Carter. Hard to argue, very hard to argue that such a man was a breath of fresh air, and yet that is what he ran on. Because he's the creature that he was sold to us as. Yes, we can. Was supposed to be something different. Both as a symbolic brace with the racist, white supremacist past of America and with the politics of the, Clinton era and Democrats. But it wasn't a breach at all. And so much so that we forget that was part of the initial appeal. But the moral energy and civic idealism that he inspired as a candidate did not carry over into his presidency. Duh. Assuming office in the midst of a financial crisis, he appointed economic advisors who had promoted financial deregulation during the Clinton years. Fuck, he had relations with Paul Volcker. With their encouragement, he bailed out the banks on terms that did not hold them account for the behavior that led to the crisis in the first place, and offered little help for those who'd lost their homes. His moral voice muted, Obama placated rather than articulated the seething public anger towards Wall Street. By the way, this is why it is important to remember Occupy Wall Street happens against Democratic Party rule, not against Republican Party rule, even though it is completely recuperated now. Lingering anger over the bailout cast a shadow over the Obama-era presidency and fueled a mood of populist protest. We see the anti-tax, anti-war protest in the Tea Party get astroturfed. I don't know why we only call right-wing things astroturfed, because NGOization is also astroturfing itself, but nonetheless, get astroturfed into what would become like the populist right. But that populist right, people forget, for all of its problematic racial overtones, etc., had elements of a libertarian right that became increasingly unpopular, and had elements of the moral majority right of the 1990s, which had largely kind of faded out of public consciousness. Back to the book. Lingering anger over the bailout cast a shadow over Obama's presidency and ultimately fueled the mood of populist protesters reached across the political spectrum. On the left, the Occupy movement and the candidacy of Bernie Sanders. On the right, the Tea Party movement and the election of Trump. And in many ways, I think it finishes the great realignment that happened starting with the 1960s. And it's really hard to argue that like a fourth of the U.S.'s political history is basically a political realignment that takes a really long time, but I think it's true. The political realignment is the shifting of a lot of the less cosmopolitan elements of the old Democratic coalition against the bourgeois, big bourgeois developmentalism of the Republicans to switch over to the Republicans themselves. And for many of the financial interests formerly aligned with the Republicans to become more and more aligned with the Democratic Party. I think that's a fact. And I think it's a fact that if you go back and read all the way back to the 70s, starts way back then, but is not thoroughgoing until the Obama presidency. While being poor is a high predictor of you voting Democratic, so is making over $250,000 a year. $250,000 a year. So while more people who make over $100,000 a year vote Republican because there's more people who make over $100,000 than make over $250,000. The moment you hit $250,000, the pendulum swings way back towards liberal policies. Although it does vary by sector and state, which should not surprise us at all. Different economic interest, different cultural interest. The populist uprising in the United States, Britain, and Europe is a backlash generally against elites, but most conspicuous casualties have been liberal and center-left political parties. The Democratic Party in the U.S., the Labour Party in Britain, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, whose share of the vote reached historic low in the 2017 federal election. Italy's Democratic vote, whose vote dropped to less than 20%. The Socialist Party in France, whose presidential nominee won only 6% in the first round of the 2017 election. So much so that, like, basically the Socialist Party is either falling to the Macron center, which barely has the legitimacy to rule at this point, or the left opposition to the socialists in France. And while there may be a small chance that Starmer's Labour actually does enough due to the absolutely dire economic conditions the UK finds itself in today, it seems like Tories could literally, shoot most of the country in the street and probably still maintain power in Britain because of the anemia of the Labor Party. However, there are some things in the United States where the success of the conservatives in the judicial realm may actually make the Democratic Party an anemic governing party of the nation for a long time. It may not, too. It's very hard to say right now. I'm not willing to put money on either direction. We haven't even got to the merit part of this book, but this is the framing. This is where we are now. Before they can hope to win back the public support, these parties need to reconsider their market-oriented technocratic approach to government. They need to rethink something subtler, but no less consequential, the attitudes toward success and failure that have accompanied the growing inequity of recent decades. They need to ask why those who have not flourished in the new economy feel the winners look down with disdain. Not only do they look down with disdain, they're open about it. And they're increasingly adopting moral postures as seen with the left, historically, as their justification. And I think we should just admit that. The fact that market leaders no longer feel the need to be neutral in cultural war issues, if not conservative, we can see that clearly there's been a change in elite attitude. I'm not saying that's good or bad either. You're not going to hear me ranting that all this is bad just because capitalists do it. But we do have to ask ourselves the question, why? And what don't they fix? After all, as I pointed out before, black wealth inequality, general poverty amongst minorities, etc., social inequality in general, none of that's been fixed by any of this stuff. Even police violence is still pretty high. So what do we do? And why we say that police violence is pretty high, where equity on, say, solving murders has dropped often by half in the past decade and a half. Reasons for that are complicated, and I am probably more radical than I sound talking about this book, but nonetheless. Let's get to the meritocratic part, though. The problem in meritocracy is not only that the practice falls short of the ideal. If that were the problem, the solution would consist in perfecting equality of opportunity, in seeking a society in which people could, whatever their starting point in life, truly rise as their efforts and talents would take them. But it's doubtful that even a perfect meritocracy would be satisfying either morally or politically. Morally, it is unclear why the talented deserve an outsized reward that market-driven societies lavish on the successful. Central to the case for a meritocratic ethic is the idea that they do not deserve to be rewarded or held back based on factors beyond their control. But is having or lacking certain talents really our own doing? If not, it is hard to see why those who rise thanks to their talents deserve greater rewards than those who may be equally hardworking but less well endowed with the gifts of the market society happen to prize. Cough, cough. Marx makes this point in Critique of the Goethe program. Cough, cough. And also socialists who want to add that like talent value added is simply we should compensate. Oh man, you were buying into some meritocratic nonsense. Those who celebrate meritocratic ideal and make it the center of their political project overlook this moral question. Those who ignore something more politically potent than the morally unattractive attitudes that the meritocratic ethic promotes among the winners and also among the losers. Among the winners, it generates hubris. Among the losers, humiliation and resentment. These moral sentiments are the heart of populist uprising against elites. More than a protest against immigration or outsourcing, the populist complaint is about the tyranny of merit, and the complaint is justified. The relentless emphasis on creating a fair meritocracy in which social positions reflect both talent and effort has a corrosive effect on the way we interpret our success. And by the way, when we accept certain set categories like gender and race as some of the things we need to correct for, and believe me, we do need to correct for them, it still belies the idea that these kinds of imbalances don't exist within those categories and don't get replicated within those categories, which statistically, my friends, they do. This is why maybe intercompetition between different kinds of groups of elites with different identity groups, many of whom have been legitimately historically marginalized, leads to all kinds of fights and policing, particularly as the pie seems to get smaller. And this actually makes the pursuit of anything like ameliorating those past, let's call them injustices, for lack of a better word, and I love that word, but nonetheless, harder and harder to deal with. Pretty clearly. Why, right? Because it associates the attempt to make certain things better with the clear attempt of certain parties to legitimize their advantage in the economy and over politics. Those two questions should be separated, but they get conflated together in this discourse. Those who celebrate the meritocratic idea, the relentless emphasis on creating a fair meritocracy. I've already meant that. The notion that system rewards talent and hard work encourages winners to consider their success their own doing, a measure of their virtue, and to look down upon those less fortunate than themselves. And we see this in the survivor bias, which is probably magnified by this kind of meritocratic thing. Meritocratic hubris reflects the tendency of winners to inhale too deeply of their success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way. This is what we call the survivor bias. It's a smug conviction that those who land on the top deserve their fate, while those on the bottom deserve theirs too, and this attitude is a moral companion of technocratic politics. A lively sense of contingency of our lot conduces to certain humility. There, for the grace of God, for the acts or the accident of the fortune, go I. But a perfect meritocracy banishes all sense of gift or grace. It diminishes our capacity to see ourselves as sharing a common fate, which leaves little room for solidarity that can arise when we reflect on the contingency of our talents and fortunes. This is what makes merit a kind of tyranny or unjust rule. I want to stop at this portion of the book, but I'm going to point out that a lot of this I actually fundamentally agree with, even as a Marxist. My problems with capitalism, however, aren't just meritocracy. That would be silly. But I do think the meritocratic problem is based on, one, the myth of merit as something which justifies rule and or advantage, and two, and probably also equally importantly, that there is certain moral legitimacy or right side of history in being a winner, and that as long as you're not a winner who is putting down people unfairly. Well, what is fair and unfair in this context? What does that even mean? We have to ask ourselves then why this is so important. Meritocracy individualizes people. It removes contingency. It removes tragedy. Sure, yes, people in a meritocratic society still feel tragedy, but in some cases, many people take things that are beyond their possible knowing, such as, like, I don't know, how much you invested into an unstable market right before a crash when you just happen to be of the age to need to pull your money out of the market and not recoup it, as happened to one of the few bad things that happened to boomers in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, or many people who benefit from wild asset appreciation that had to do with knock-on effects from policy that wasn't even aimed at that, which is probably true until the last year or so in the United States. If there's a critique of this, it is, a critique of this is that it doesn't get that, this society is not just a moral problem, there's also an economic problem. The economic justification gets glossed over, but the moral justification, right? And Sandel sees that, but doesn't really tie the economics explicitly. And in fact, he, comments that the purely economistic view is not good enough. And I think he's right. But I also think we need to really look at the way economic changes and shifts in industrialization led to this situation. It's not just globalization was imposed as part of a neoliberal project, although that is part of it, but it is also that there really was an inability to maintain the Fordist social system in the 1970s, and there has been no real interest or no real place to return labor back to the fore, because frankly, labor is not as important in producing a society in the same way. So many more people are involved in services, which is atomized and low profit margin. These are the kinds of things you need to add to the Sandel communitarian critique of the current situation. And we who have a strong tradition of Marxism should be inclined to do so. But we're also inclined to just throw these ideas out, or maybe pretend that they are, too liberal or too conservative or whatever. I think we have to ask ourselves what a community we could build would look like. What would fairness look like? What were the values that instill that? Because that's part of the system, even the metaphysical assumptions that justify what we do. Merit can never be neutral, and its proposed neutrality is part of the problem. It's a false neutrality, just like the false neutrality of the administrative state, etc. It is not neutral, and it cannot be neutral. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed these kinds of discussions. We're going to be doing more from this book. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. We'll come back to some of the Sandel books. I'm also going to be covering William and Geist and continuing discussions of Bunghal Chan. And I will also start doing Marxology explainers and maybe why I think some of the Marxological questions are not answerable or maybe not useful to answer. But to do that, we should actually go through them. And that's what we will be doing. So there's a lot coming up on this channel. I hope you like the education focus of this channel. I know that like increasingly like half of episodes there's me reading and commentating on things, but I do want people to take these ideas and books and whatnot seriously, even if they're not in comportment with their political philosophy. And I will be doing more arcane Marxist critical theory and whatnot too. Don't worry about it. I'm going to do it. But I also think some of these more basic ways of thinking and orientating ourselves might be useful when we come back to that. After all, Byung-Chul Han actually picks up on many of the things in Sandel and Michael Taylor, both indirectly. I mean, in Charles Taylor, not Michael Taylor. Both indirectly and directly. Like there's a whole commentary on Taylor's communitarian culture of authenticity and the liberal communitarianism that Taylor is trying to promote, which Byung-Chul Han is trying to point out has very problematic assertions. And then when you add modern technology in it, becomes even more dystopic. And it's related to this. But we'll also be doing more traditional explainers of Marxology and stuff like that. So I'll be talking about, the origins of dialectical material and all that too. Don't worry, that part of the show's not gone. And I will be continuing to discuss things like the German historical school and parts of things that are outside of the Marxist tradition that are important to the development of modern left and right thinking, and we need to understand their initial context and how they might be used today. So I hope you enjoy that. I'd like to thank all my patrons, but particularly my patrons who the Kano Kahanan level. I will do shout outs to the new peeps who have become Kano Kahanans. Kano Kahanans benefit is they get prioritized QAs, they get everything they want to get that they want to get. If they want to be on a patrons only show, they can inquire. They can set a topic for QAs for the twice a month QA. They have a lot of say over what goes on behind the Patreon wall. Also in my Discord, we're running 3 different book groups. One on category theory with Alex Prahasa. One on Capital Volume 3 with the group at large, although I don't participate in that one because I have very opinionated views on Capital's Volume 1 through 3. And don't want to actually corrupt my students with my views on them because I don't think I could be neutral. And I will also be doing a book review. We're doing a series behind the Patreon on Kohei Sato's first book, Marx, Nature, and the Unfinished Critique of Political Economy. And some other stuff's coming up. We got a lot of stuff coming up on Hal Draper. We got stuff. We'll be continuing our series on all kinds of stuff. By the time this comes out, I should have finished the historical school and gone back to Warner Sunbart. But there's all kinds of stuff coming up. So I'd like to thank the kind of 100 pages Joe P. and Sif. Thank you so much for your support. It really means a lot to me. And I'd like to thank all my patrons. There are approximately 400 of you. And so I appreciate that. There's some material released almost every day. So if you want some of that material, you can get it for as low as $3 a month. But if you don't want to pay, there's plenty of material here. I also release a video here at least 5 times a week now. Most of them short, admittedly, these little explainer videos, some of them quite longer. And at least once a week, there's an at least 1 hour long interview. Sometimes they go to 2 and 3 hours. Who knows? All right. Thank you for your support, and I hope you have a great day. And if you do me a favor, like and subscribe, share and share alike, and comment if you like what I have to say. Maybe you want me to go into this meritocratic stuff more. Maybe you think that the Marxists talking about the communitarian stuff is fishy. Just tell me. Have a great day.